this is David Rizzo from Rogers Gardens, and thank you for joining me today. And today we're going to talk about greens. So now is the time, as we go into winter and we're cooling off and we're starting to get colder nights, damper nights, still a little warm in the afternoon. I'm going to start talking about greens, on how to grow greens, lettuce, and all the greens, what to use them for too, what for cooking, for juicing. And so we're going to go through it. I'm going to split it in two parts, and then I'll talk a lot about on how to trim them, how to harvest them, spacing, and yeah. Okay, now the first thing I want to talk about is some of your larger greens, like more into the Swiss chard and the kale and the mustard greens and all your larger varieties that you would use more for braising and for sauteing. So the first one I'll talk about is your mustard greens. So mustard greens are really good. They're going to get a little taller, so you're going to put them in the back of the garden. I always prune off the outer leaves like this for using when you cook them. Give them a little bit of room when you plant them too. I'll usually give them about 12 to 16 inches apart because they get taller. These are more spicy, and you can, if you really use mustard greens a lot, you can do a cut and come again where you actually light trim the top. See, I'm going to light trim the top, but I'm missing that growth, so it keeps on regrowing. It's almost like how you would do lettuce, like a cut and come again, so then I can use this for my cooking. Sometimes though, see how this really thick stem? I'll pinch this stem off because I want more of the leaves, but if you like more crunchiness, then you could definitely use the stems. And so with the mustard greens, there's so many different varieties, like the Osaka red and the green Osaka, and there's even seeds. This is Mizuna. Mizuna is a really good one. Mizuna is more of a milder mustard green. I like using that, but give them a little room, space them, and amending them and feeding them. They're just like growing other types of chard and kale. You want to make sure that you water them evenly, not too much. So I'm only watering about once or twice a week, but give them a little bit of room, and not really heavy feeders, but you would feed them when you plant. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the kales. So this is more of a, I'm going to probably go back and forth with if they're juicing, if they're more braising or sauteing. So these are really good for juicing or actually sauteing. So there's a lot of different varieties of kale. Red Russian kale is a really good one. These really, you don't see them that much in the market because they don't ship well, but the flavor is really good on these. So I like the Red Russian kale, and I like the Italian kale. I'm out of the curly leaf kale, but that's another good one to use for juicing, because kale is really good. So even when you trim this, kale is going to get tall, so definitely give it room. I always like I was saying earlier with the Malibu compost, I like to feed really good and work the Malibu compost and the worm castings on the surface to give nutrients, because most of your leafy greens aren't really heavy feeders, but just have the nutrients for it breaking down as they grow. So kale's good. Kale's going to get tall, so we're going to put it in the back with the other taller vegetables, and space it about 16 inches apart also. With kale, I always will do the same thing as I'm going to move this. Let me move this, and I'll actually cut it lightly. And then as it grows, I'll keep cutting it really lightly and just keep on using the leaves. And so, because that's your best, like when you're using the kale, kale is really good. Kale is very nutritious for you too, so love the kale. And then even with the Red Russian, again, I'll miss that little crown. So even when I cut it, and again, it's like cut and come again. This is like almost like baby green. So this is the Red Russian kale, so love doing this. Now, kale takes a long time to germinate and grow, so better to really buy the plants that are started, because it can take up to 6 to 8 weeks of your growing it from seed. But that's why I buy the plants. And with kale produces a lot, so you don't really have to buy a lot of plants unless you're juicing a lot. So sometimes I'll only put 1 or 2, 3 kales in the garden, maybe a couple Red Russian, maybe some of the dinosaur kale. So you don't really need a lot of kale. 1 or 2 plants is more than enough for the season. Okay, now we're going to go through some of the other types of greens that you can braise and saute with, where I like celery and then I like Swiss chard. And the one thing with celery, a lot of people wait for it to fully get into like a head. I don't wait for celery actually to to go into a head because I'm using the smaller greens as I go. So what I always do, I always just go through and I always cut. That's the main thing I want to stress is I always cut above the crown. So even if I take some of this and I'm cutting a little here, a little here, a little here, you can see how the greens from the crown are still going to come back. If you cut underneath that, then the plant won't come back. So I'm using these real tender little shoots. And with celery, when you're growing it, again, it's a larger leafed green, so you want to put it in the back of the garden and give it some space. But with celery, celery is always good planting it in later October and going into spring, but usually by March it gets bitter and I take it out. So, but I keep on just doing the cut and come again. So the little fresh shoots are real tender and good flavor. You can juice them, you can braise them, you can fresh eat them. So always just keep cutting. Again, it's a cut and come again. And I like one of my favorite varieties. There's this Utah Giant. This is a good one, but I like Tango. This was Tango, and Tango is really good because it doesn't get as tall and it usually doesn't get as bitter. So one of the good ones for the garden, so that's celery, so keep on planting your celery. And then with chard, chard is another good one. So rainbow chard, that's really good for sauteing and juicing and all your things. And again with this, I'm light trimming above there. And this I want to space in the garden about 12 to 16 inches, give it a little room. And it always looks sort of wimpy when you first plant it. Once we cool down and it really takes off into the garden, and then it's going to get longer, and just keep harvesting it. But again, you're going to cut right above that little growth. So again, cut and come again. So, and then even if I cut these, then I can mix them together. Like I can mix with my kale, my red Russian kale, my chard, and I can saute them together. A lot of people want to always separate stuff and do it separate, where even like the celery right here can blend it all together when I juice and when I cook. Okay, now we're going to go through some of the bitter greens, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about arugula. Arugula is a very easy one to grow. I usually get it with the little color packs like this. This is a variety called Astro, and I like this. Really good to grow. If you plant a lot, you can really plant a lot of arugula if you use it a lot. It tends to be a little bit more spicier and peppery, which it really will give a kick to some of your juicing, your sauteing, but love it. And you can make pesto out of it too. So I'm actually going to take one of the bigger, these are little starts, and I plant them about every 10, 12 inches. And so they grow really quick. But what I want to do is I want to grab one of the older ones. Let me actually, even though they don't look super good, but see, this is the time to start pruning it. So what I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to cut it right above that crown. So then I harvested a lot of it. So that's your arugula, and see how I cut it. But when I plant, this is the main thing when I plant. I always wait for the plants to establish for about 4 to 6 weeks before I start harvesting. So if you want, and a lot of times I'll peel off those roots, and I want them to grow before I really start cutting them. So I'll wait a little long. So they'll go really from about this little size. Let me grab one out of here. So they'll go from this little size to this larger size. So this is planting, and this is probably 4 to 6 weeks out. That's when I start harvesting, usually about a month out from planting, because then the roots are nice established, and then they won't go into shock. So sometimes if you start pruning on stuff that's too young, it will go into shock on you. So that's why space them out about 10, 12 inches. You can put your compost, your amendment, make sure they get watered. Very easy to grow, very fast to grow. But the big difference right now, as we cool off and go more into fall and winter, arugula likes cooler weather. So it likes when you're 65 in the day and 40s at night. It doesn't like it when it's hot. So in the summertime, it's going to get bitter, it's going to bolt. So now we're going into the season to plant it. So and one of my favorite varieties, I love Astro. There's a lot of different blends of arugula, so Astro is my favorite. Okay, now I'm going to talk about beets. So beets are one of my favorite things to saute, and a lot of people always think of it more as a root crop, but what I do is I'm always cutting off the tops because they always keep coming back. So I love to saute the tops. So my favorite varieties for beets, I love the red beets, like the bull's blood. There's another one called Detroit Red. I like those. The gold beets are really good too. They're closer to a Swiss chard, so really flavorful, really good. One of my favorites for juicing is this variety called Early Wonder. And Early Wonder has the red stems and the green leaf, and when you harvest the root on this is one of the most juicy, sweet, so this is really a juicing beet. And so again, when I'm trimming off the tops to saute, I'll always take my scissors and let's see if I can hold it up. And I'm gonna miss the crown, so see the little crown, so I'm gonna cut right above it. It's hard to hold it without dropping it, so I'm gonna cut like real lightly. Let's see, without dropping it. So I dropped it, but see again, I have all that new growth that it's gonna come from, and then I have all the greens to saute, and they're very nutritious too, very high in vitamin C, so I love sauteing the beets. And beets are easy to grow. If you're growing them for the greens, then you can buy the transplants, but if you're really growing them for the roots, I do seeds. So that's the biggest difference is if I'm growing them for the greens, the beet greens, then I'll do the transplants. But if I want them for the bulbs, you're gonna have a better bulb and it's gonna grow nicer if you do them from seed. And when you start the seeds, you'll plant the seeds about every 2 inches apart. You do a little row of them, and it takes them a little while to germinate. It takes about 10 or 15 days, so water them really good and be patient for them to germinate. And if you want the roots, direct sow them. Okay, now we're gonna go over cilantro. And cilantro, the main thing with cilantro is most people try to grow it in the summer and it's too hot and it bolts. So cilantro doesn't like it when it's 80, 85 degrees and 60s at night. It's just gonna send up a flower. But what I've learned, if you plant the seeds of the plants right now as we go into late this month in October, it loves the cool weather. So it loves it when it's 60, 65 in the day and 40s at night. You'll harvest it all the way till March, and then you rip it out and plant more of it. So it won't bolt on you, because I know a lot of people use cilantro as a summer herb, but it really likes cooler weather. So there's a couple different varieties. One of my favorites though, I love Leisure. Leisure is a really good one, and a lot of people don't know with cilantro, it's actually a monogerm, so it has 1 to 3 seeds in that fruit. So when you grow it, it takes a little long to germinate, just like a beet. Beets are monogerms too, so it can take about 15 days, about 2 weeks. So you gotta water them really good for that seed coat to break down. Some seed companies actually will split the seeds in half, so then they germinate in half the a time. Like sometimes if they're split, they might germinate in like 7 days. So Leisure's a good one, they're slow bolting. And then I brought some of the 4-inch ones up, and with cilantro you can plant them really close. You can put them about 6 to 8 inches apart because they're not going to get really tall. They're going to stay low at about 6 to 10 inches. They might over time get taller, but the one thing, grow them now, and harvesting too, cut above that crown. And so like even when I harvest them, I'm gonna go through and I'm gonna cut them right across. Like I don't know if you can see that little new growth, and cut them right across. And then I can use, and you know, when I juice them and when I'm making salsa, I put stems and all in there. A lot of people like to cut the stems off, but you know what? It's all gonna break down, or it's gonna grind it up. But love the flavor of cilantro. It really lasts good right now. Watering it, you'll probably water it through the winter once or twice a week, but as we get colder, so you don't rot them out, only water your garden once a week. If we have a little storm, a little rainstorm, skip a week, you know, don't water for a week. And so definitely with cilantro, but that's the biggest thing with cilantro. Planting it in the winter time, you'll get it to last longer because it likes cooler weather. Just like arugula is the same thing. Arugula doesn't like the summer, so plant your cilantro right now and you'll get a long harvest, either from seed or from plants. Okay, so now we're gonna talk about spinach. So spinach is a really important green, and spinach has a lot of nutrients in it too. High vitamin C, high iron, and with spinach it's really neat. You can keep on cutting it like lettuce and it'll keep on coming back. But the one thing I've learned about spinach, there are so many different varieties. Some are good, some are not so good, but I really like one of my favorites that we have right here. It's called lavua, like this is a really good one. There's Corsair, there's Space, there's so many different varieties, but I do like the smaller. Yeah, Bloomsdale is really good, but Bloomsdale is more of like a Savoy type. It has more of a thicker leaf, but I like sort of the baby spinaches. And the one thing with the baby spinaches, now is a good time to plant them. You can plant them really close. So I group them in with like the greens because they stay low. They're only gonna get about 6 inches tall, maybe 8 inches tall. I group them with the lettuces. So when I plant them, you can do seeds. I like to do direct sowing of seeds because the one thing with spinach has a little taproot. And sometimes with transplants, they don't do as well, even though I do carry the transplants. But generally when I'm planting them, I'll squeeze one out and I'll show you. This is one little plant right here. So that's one little spinach right there. I do little rows of them. And again, with this, it's just cut and come again. I've used spinach a lot. Really good for sauteing, really good for juicing. But when you plant spinach right now, it will grow all the way into March of next year. So very long lived. But one thing with spinach you have to watch out with is it doesn't like to be overwatered. So when you do water it, you have to be a little moderate with it. So you got to soak it, skip about, 4 or 5 days, maybe 7 days, and let it dry out a little bit. It doesn't like to be really wet. And so with harvesting this, again, these are little plants. I usually will wait a couple weeks to harvest them, but if I harvest this one, again, right above that crown, and I'm leaving that new growth, and then I got my leaves, and spinach is so tender and so good, but I do like to make little rows of spinach, and I space the rows usually about 6 to 8 inches apart, and I always go shallow. So when the seed's very small, you'll really make a shallow little trench with your finger, and I'll usually go about a ½ inch. Make a little row, sprinkle the seeds. One thing that I do, I don't do any thinning on my greens or my spinach. I let it all grow because what I do is I really loosen out the soil and I try to break up that clay and that soil down to 10 or 12 inches, because if those roots can go down, you're not gonna have a problem with them stretching or failing. So make sure they're in full sun, 6 to 8 hours of sun, and I don't thin. I let them go, but I make sure when I do turn over my beds to plant, I make sure that soil is nice and loose and deep with my compost and my worm casting. So that's important. So with it, so yeah, and pretty fast germinating. And once they germinate, they'll take off pretty quick. So really good spinach, really fresh, and just keep cutting it out of the garden. That's the main thing with any of these. Don't let them go so long where they're almost bolting. Just keep on trimming them. Now we're going to talk about lettuce. And so lettuce, when you really go into the fall and winter, lettuce likes cooler weather, again, like a lot of the other winter vegetables. So 60 in the day and about 40, 45 at night. So a lot of people try to plant lettuce in the summertime. I don't plant lettuce in summer at all. I'm just starting to put my lettuce in now. So around Halloween is when I start planting my lettuce. And so I love, like, lettuce is one of my favorite things to grow. So we have a lot of different varieties. So you have romaine. Romaine I love because it's your crunchier lettuce. So this is really good. And when I space out the romaine, I plant them pretty close. They're gonna go about 4 to 6 inches apart. I do sometimes put these in the back of the garden, or in the middle of the garden actually, because they'll get taller. One of my favorites though that I actually do a lot, I love to do the mixture of the lettuces. So you have romaine in here, you have royal oak leaf and red romaine. So I like the mixes because then I can just keep on cutting them. So the gourmet mixes, so they're more leaf lettuces, and very easy to do the cut and come again, because I can trim and cut these and they should last till about March or so. So very long lived, very good. The seeds I like, well, I have to say though, one of my favorites, and a lot of people don't talk that much about it, but one of my favorites, I'm gonna grab one of the plants out and then I'll show you the seeds too. But I love royal oak leaf. And it's more of a leaf lettuce, it's a loose head type. So this is the little plant right here, but it's an heirloom, baby oak leaf, royal oak leaf. I love the flavor of this. So not that crunchy, but really good flavor. So the oak leaf is really good. Some of the seeds that I grow a lot at home, this is another one of my favorites called gourmet baby greens. And this has a mixture of different leaf lettuces in it. It has the red sales. This is another good one that's the red leaf lettuce, but you don't have to buy all these different seeds. You get them in one pack. So I do really like to start a lot of my lettuces at home from seed, and I direct sow them in the garden, but there's so many good blends. There's more of the Asian baby leaves. This could be more braising, sauteing and braising. So these are good. That will have mizuna and arugula and mustard greens in there. That's a really good mix. Let's see what, I really like this Wine Country mesclun, another really good blend. And then you have the romaine blends like the baby leaf lettuce blends. But that's the one thing. And another thing that you can do that I do a lot, and I know nobody really talks about this. So if I take my baby gourmet greens, I can actually mix in arugula or spinach with it. Then I just cut the whole thing and I have it all in a mix, a mesclun. And mesclun just is a term for mixed. So when you see mesclun, it's mixed. So mixed varieties of different greens. But I love the lettuce. The lettuce is so good. And fertilizing it, you're really not feeding it too much. Again, put your Malibu compost down early, a little bit of worm castings, plant them really close. And with harvesting, let me show you, because I got some really tall romaine and there's some broccoli, but I'm gonna grab one of these romaines, and this is pretty tall. I would have already cut it by now, but sometimes with the heat they stretch a little bit. That's why it's better to plant them in winter. I pick off some of the leaves that aren't bad, and then I cut it right about in here. I'm gonna set it down, but cut it right there so I have a nice, and I wash this off. So this is the taller romaine called Paris Cos, which is the French variety. There's a lot of variations. There's another one that I couldn't find the seeds of that I grow a lot called Little Gem. So wash that off, and sometimes I'll put it into a colander and I'll soak it really good and wash all the dirt off it because it has a lot of dirt on it, and plant them close. And that's pretty much it for the lettuces, but definitely now is a time to direct sow them. This is another good one right here, the new Red Fire, which has more of the head. I don't do the head lettuces as much because they take so long. So my favorite thing to do with greens, when I am planting all the lettuces, I want to harvest, and I want to keep on harvesting. So I do less of the butter crunch and the icebergs because they take about 80-85 days to harvest them. And when you harvest them, that's it. You trim them once and they don't come back. They don't regrow. So when I'm doing all my greens, I like stuff that I can keep on cutting, and then I get a continuous harvest for the next couple months going into spring. Okay, now we're going to talk about soil. So I keep the soil pretty basic. So even when I'm like, I'll go through, so when I'm potting my greens up into containers, and usually I didn't talk too much about containers, but always medium-sized container, 10 or 12 inches deep. I always do the Malibu potting soil, because one thing I like with the Malibu, it drains really good and there's a lot of nutrients in it. So they use an organic fertilizer called Down to Earth, and they're really good. So that's why I like using the Malibu potting soil. And so the next thing for more into the garden, I like the Malibu. So the Malibu, I'm using it for nutrients and I'm working it on the surface. So I'll take my Malibu compost, work it on the surface really good, and then I'll blend my worm castings on the surface really good, and I'll mix my fertilizer up with it. And that way, when you're mixing your compost and your nutrients on the surface, they always have a tendency to start breaking down as you water. Since we don't get a lot of rain, with these composts, it's good to really water them in so they release those humic acids. That's very important for nutrients, but always work stuff on the surface, especially raised beds and even your regular garden. And if you have really heavy clay, there's another compost I use that's called soil building compost. That's another one I use for breaking up clay. But these two I use more for nutrients on the surface. Okay, now I want to talk about fertilizers. And so one thing to remember with fertilizing the greens right now, once you've taken out all your summer crops like your tomatoes, peppers, corn, they're heavy feeders, so they're going to take a lot of nutrients out of the ground. So I want to supply that soil with a little bit more NPK, so my nitrogen, my phosphorus, and potassium. Even though greens aren't heavy feeders, I do want to put some down, and what I always do is I'll usually put my fertilizer down first, and then I'll put my worm castings and my Malibu compost over and I'll work it in. So I don't really use a lot of fertilizers, but my favorite that I use on my garden every year, I like the all-purpose, which really should be the vegetable food of the Down to Earth. So this is a really good one. This is a 462, high calcium, and so very high in nutrients, but you always want to put it down first before your compost and lightly work it in. So that's one of my main fertilizers that I use in all the greens. I use it on my broccoli, use it on my lettuce, use it on all the winter vegetables. So that's going to go down first. Now I want to talk about compost teas. So one of my most important things that I like to do when I'm fertilizing my greens and even all my winter vegetables. So I use my all-purpose fertilizer from Down to Earth, but I like the Malibu tea from Malibu. So it comes in a giant tea bag, and so what you do is you steep this in water. I tie it off to the bucket, so it's going to be submerged in the water, and I steep it usually for like a day or two, and I aerate it. So then what I do is I'll water it into the greens about every 2 to 3 weeks because I have a little nutrient. So that's really important, and I do that with arugula and cilantro, and so every couple weeks what I do is I like to get it in the water and I squeeze the bag to get all these nutrients, because this is Malibu compost they put into a little tea bag. So use your compost tea for nutrients, and I usually do it about every 2 to 3 weeks, but it mainly seems like I'll do it about 3 times for the vegetables in the winter, and then that's about it. Now for going over some of the organic insecticides I use, the 2 worst insects you're going to have through the winter, you're going to have the silver aphids and then some of the caterpillars from the white moth or the cabbage loopers. So what I do for the aphids, the silver aphids, I like the organic soap. So Safer is one of the best soaps, and one thing that's really good about the Safer, it has a seaweed extract, but really good. So if I see any of those silver aphids on any of my winter vegetables or my lettuce, I use the organic soap. Now if I have a problem with the caterpillars like the loopers and the cabbage worms, I'll use an organic spray called BT. So sometimes if they're really bad, I'll use this about every 2 weeks. And then with the soap, I'm just using it as I see them. But definitely the BT will work for the caterpillars, and it doesn't affect anything else. It only goes after caterpillars. So yeah, Bacillus thuringiensis, good for the cabbage worms, good for the cabbage loopers that are really going to go after a lot of the vegetables in the wintertime. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you learned a lot, and don't forget to follow us on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook, and happy gardening, guys.